Imagine putting a wild idea on paper and then watching the real world copy it. A science fiction legend writes about chain-reacting atomic bombs that force a political realignment, decades before Hiroshima and the Cold War. A TV pilot airdates a plot about a passenger jet aimed at the World Trade Center months before 9/11. Terrifying? Definitely. Supernatural? Not so fast. This video digs into historical predictions that appeared in fiction, journalism, and public talks. Cases where warnings lined up with future events so closely they still raise eyebrows. The Titan and the Titanic. In 1898, sailor-turned-author Morgan Robertson published a short novel with an unassuming title, Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. In it, a record-breaking luxury liner, the Titan, is touted as practically unsinkable. She steams across the North Atlantic in April, pushes for speed despite reports of ice, and slams into an iceberg on the starboard side. There aren't enough lifeboats. The ship goes down with heavy loss of life. When the Titanic sank in April 1912 after striking an iceberg, the echoes were impossible to ignore, and the Titan-Titanic comparison became a permanent part of maritime folklore. Here's the sober read. It isn't mystical. Robertson understood shipping, routes, and human nature, especially the industry's obsession with prestige and speed, and he extrapolated quick specifics to ground the parallels. In Robertson's tale, the Titan displaces about 45,000 tons and carries 24 lifeboats, grossly insufficient for the 3,000-plus souls aboard. The real Titanic's registered tonnage and dimensions differed, but the lifeboat policy problem was real. She sailed with 20 boats for over 2,200 passengers and crew, meeting outdated regulations keyed to tonnage tables rather than capacity. Ice warnings on North Atlantic routes were common, and speed pressure was a cultural norm among prestige liners. Those aren't paranormal coincidences. They're predictable failure modes. W.T. Stead, the editor who died in his own prediction. If Robertson was the novelist warning in fiction, W.T. Stead was the journalist doing it in plain English. Back in 1886, Stead published a story about a transatlantic liner that carried too few lifeboats, predicting exactly how a mass casualty disaster would unfold. He wrote with a kind of moral urgency, less crystal ball, more policy indictment. Fast forward to 1912. Stead boards the Titanic. He doesn't survive. The irony is brutal, but the takeaway is clearer than ever. People had spelled out the risk for decades. The Board of Trade regulations were antiquated. Lifeboat capacity was keyed to tonnage tables, rather than human beings on board. When the real emergency came, the arithmetic failed. H.G. Wells and the atomic bomb. H.G. Wells didn't invent atomic physics, but in 1914 he wrote a novel that nailed the part history would find most terrifying. Weaponization. In The World Set Free, Wells imagines a breakthrough in tapping the atom's energy and describes atomic bombs whose chain reactions don't simply explode, they continue to burn and radiate, forcing nations into a reckoning about war and world governance. 3 decades later, the Manhattan Project produced nuclear weapons that changed geopolitics forever. 2 caveats that actually make the segment stronger. First, Wells' atomic bombs don't map neatly to real fission devices. Second, many scientists were independently theorizing about nuclei and chain reactions. Wells also anticipated a phenomenon we still wrestle with. Technology doesn't arrive with an instruction manual for ethics. He imagined not just a bigger explosion, but a longer shadow, radiation, contamination, and generational fear shaping politics. That geopolitical prediction proved depressingly accurate as nuclear strategy came to dominate international relations from 1945 onward. But that's the point. Wells understood the direction of travel well enough to sketch the moral and political consequences, which came true with chilling accuracy. Deterrence, arms races, and a persistent fear of civilization-ending war. Dark Winter, 2001. And Clade X, 2018. Years before COVID-19, biodefense experts ran tabletop drills that eerily foreshadowed our blind spots. Dark Winter, June 2001, simulated a smallpox attack in the US, exposing shortages in vaccines, hospital surge capacity, and crisis communications. Later exercises like CLADEX 2018 walked leaders through a fast-moving respiratory pandemic that overwhelmed supply chains and governance. None of these drills claimed the calendar. They did predict the friction points, bottleneck diagnostics, coordination failures, and the temptation to politicize science. The China Syndrome and 3 Mile Island. On March 16, 1979, the film The China Syndrome hit theaters. It follows a TV reporter who stumbles into a nuclear plant safety scandal and a near meltdown. 12 days later, March 28th, Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania suffered a partial meltdown after equipment failures and operator error. The real-world accident didn't mirror the film's exact corporate conspiracy, but the timing made the movie look prophetic and changed public conversation about nuclear safety overnight. The Lone Gunman's 9/11-like plot. On March 4, 2001, The Lone Gunman, a spin-off of The X-Files, premiered with a pilot about a remotely hijacked passenger jet aimed at the World Trade Center to provoke war for profit. The heroes managed to pull the aircraft up at the last second. 6 months later, the September 11th attacks shocked the world. The show didn't predict the perpetrators or methods in detail, but it did game out a painfully plausible vulnerability, which is exactly what good writers do when they ask, what if?
I'm going to crash the plane into the World Trade Center.
Tom Clancy's Airliner as Weapon. While we're in aviation, in 1994, Tom Clancy's novel Dead of Honor climaxes with a hijacked 747 crashing into the U.S. Capitol during a joint session of Congress. It lands 7 years before September 11th and is frequently cited as an example of mainstream fiction, mapping out the use of civilian aircraft as weapons. No, it didn't forecast the specific actors, targets, or methods, but it belonged to a body of thought that asked a hard question early. What if a system designed for convenience is turned into a weapon? The next outbreak? We're not ready. In 2015, Bill Gates gave a TED Talk with a thesis that aged like a jump scare. The 21st century catastrophe we weren't ready for wasn't nuclear war. It was a highly infectious respiratory virus. He called for tabletop exercises, germ games, rapid vaccine platforms, contact tracing infrastructure, and stockpiled resources. 5 years later, COVID-19 turned those bullet points into breaking news. You don't need to endorse any particular policy to concede his core point. Our systems were tuned for bombs, not biothreats. Orwell and modern surveillance. Not every terrifying prediction detonates in a single day. Some seep in. Published in 1949, George Orwell's 1984 described a state apparatus that saturates daily life with surveillance, manipulation, and selective truth. It wasn't a forecast with a date. It was a template. And parts of the modern world have fit themselves to it disturbingly well. From ubiquitous cameras and bulk data collection to behavioral tracking in the apps we can't stop using, the novel reads less like a warning label and more like an operations manual humanity keeps borrowing. Technology has made broad surveillance cheap and tempting. Democratic norms decide how far it goes. That's the terrifying part. Nothing supernatural, just incentives and apathy. Don't be spooked, be ready. Here's the unsettling truth. The future rarely sneaks up on us. We just decline the off-ramps. If one segment here convinced you we blew past a warning, tell me which one. Policy, training, tech, or culture. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, tap subscribe, and ring the bell.